The warm, golden light poured over the table like a thin layer of honey, gliding across the crystal glasses and tracing the edges of the white porcelain plates. To the faint jazz playing in the corner, the man by the window lifted his head. His face was carved by the light into sharp lines. High cheekbones, a solid jawline, a straight nose, and gray eyes cold as misted glass. Clara froze at the threshold. In that instant, she realized she had just stepped into a world that wasn't hers, a world scented with expensive cologne, laced with brown butter, where the refined clink of silverware could slice silence apart, and where everything was polished until even glances seemed sharpened. She didn't belong here. Ethan Cole. He said it as if he were reading a business card. His voice was deep, clipped, flat, leaving no room for a smile. Clara tightened her grip on her bag handle, her fingertips going cold. Rare find. Hannah's phrase she had chirped all week suddenly sounded like mockery. And across the width of a dinner table, that rare find radiated a halo of arrogance, colder than the air conditioner humming above. Hey, Soul Stories fam. We're about to begin a brand new love journey. Please comment on where you're watching from so we can see that our Soul Stories family is all around the world. 1 hour earlier. No, Hannah, I'm not going, Clara snapped, pushing aside her stack of Shakespeare essays. Blind dates are nightmares. I'd rather grade another class. Hannah, as always, refused to back down. Hugging her lesson plans, she tried to balance them on top of a wobbling tower of books. Clara, listen. It's Ethan Cole, CEO, famous lawyer, brains plus bank account plus perfect jawline. Just one dinner. If it doesn't work out, we'll watch Pride and Prejudice. I already bought the popcorn. Charming, Clara smirked. More like troublesome. Hannah exhaled, her eyes pleading. You've been singing the single girl anthem too long. Go once for me, please. Clara surrendered to that look. She slipped on a pale blue dress, promising herself she'd be home before 9. She had no idea tonight's clock hands would cut into her life in a way no one could predict. Back at the restaurant, Clara pulled out her chair, leaning back just enough to keep her distance. The man in front of her still didn't smile. His eyes swept over her slowly, cataloging her wrist, the curve of her collar, the neat braid. Like a file opening on a screen, he read her in silence. The waiter leaned in to pour wine. Crimson liquid slid into the glass, casting a dark red sheen. Clara waved it off. Water, please. The corner of Ethan's eye twitched, a movement so small she would have missed it if she weren't watching. He tilted his glass, sipped, and finally spoke. You're punctual. Teaching makes me obsessive about punctuality. Clara tried to lighten it, her tone still polite. You teach? He asked it as if checking off a line on a form. Literature, high school. His pale gray gaze paused for a beat, then slid away as if the word hadn't even brushed his interest. Fairly ordinary job. He rotated the stem of his glass with 2 fingers, calm to the point of cold. Probably not very challenging. Heat flared in Clara's face like a match struck inside her chest. What stung wasn't the words but the polished indifference in his voice, the tone of a man used to filing judgments into reports. Not very challenging? She let out a laugh, crisp but bitter. Try standing in front of 30 rebellious teenagers and convincing them a line of poetry can save a bad day, then tell me again. Ethan didn't flinch. He set his glass down with a sound so soft it felt cruel. I didn't mean to offend, he added, like noting a correction. I just think with your abilities, you should have chosen a career that creates more value. Value. The word hit with the heavy clink of a coin dropped in an empty tin. Clara set her water glass down hard, the thud echoing through the polished air. What kind of value? Money? Investment portfolios? Sorry, but for me, value is when a child finally understands why a character did something foolish for love, when their eyes light up because they realize they're not alone. I don't know if that makes it into your quarterly reports. At the next table, a knife scraped a plate, metal clinking. The jazz shifted to autumn leaves, the saxophone dripping from the bar like mockery. Ethan leaned back, unblinking. Perhaps, he said slowly, condensing the argument into 4 words. We don't share a framework. In the silence that followed, Clara heard her heartbeat, not from nerves but from anger as stark as ink spilling onto white paper. She thought of tutoring a boy who couldn't read a paragraph, of the girl who stuttered through a poem until she suddenly beamed with pride. She thought of coming home with chalk dust clinging to her fingers and realized how intolerable the arrogance in front of her was. She stood. The chair screeched across the floor and heads turned. "You're right," she said, her voice clear and low. "We're not a match. I'd rather read a book than sit here being judged. I hope you find a woman who meets your idea of value." She turned. The slit of her blue dress cut sharply across the light, like an exclamation point. "Miss Bennett!" Ethan's voice caught her for a beat. Not to apologize, just enough for her name to sound flat as a heading. "I'll tell Hannah that." "That I'm fine," Clara cut in, without looking back. "And it'd be better not to repeat this." The door swallowed her into the night. The chill of rain and damp trees hit her face, cooling the fire that had just flared. She stood a moment on the steps, the restaurant sign blinking on the wet street. Her phone buzzed Hannah's text. "Hang in there. If it's awful, I've got the oven hot, apple pie ready." Clara stared at the screen, inhaled deeply. "Awful, Hannah. Awful squared." She hailed a cab. As the car rolled away, she glimpsed through the glass, the man by the window still sitting just so. Upright, unmoving, like a statue placed exactly where it belonged. Then the streetlight swallowed him. "Want some music on?" the driver asked. "No, thanks." Clara leaned her head against the glass, feeling the cold seep through her hair. In her mind, the words replayed like a tape. Ordinary, not very challenging. More value. She let out a short laugh, sharp and small. "More value," she muttered. "Who gets to define that anyway?" A message popped up. "So how's it going, future Mrs. Cole?" Hannah teasing again. Clara typed fast. "Game over. I'm coming home. Never again." She hit send, carefully set her phone on the seat, as if afraid another reckless thought might burst out. Outside, the city slid by with pale yellow windows, each holding a story she'd never know. Maybe a woman laughing on the phone. Maybe a boy wrestling with math homework. Maybe a man in a suit, tie loosened, staring at a half-empty glass of wine, thinking about 4 words, different framework. And here she was, Clara Bennett, high school literature teacher, fresh from the worst and maybe the most unforgettable blind date of her life. She swore that next time Hannah mentioned a rare find, she'd lock her best friend in the archives room for 2 hours. The cab turned, wipers brushing the windshield. Clara shut her eyes. The anger ebbed, leaving a quiet hollow just wide enough for the night air to drop in a single speck of dust, a question she wouldn't name. Why, for the briefest second, when he looked up, had she seen something besides arrogance? She opened her eyes just in time to see the La Belle Étoile sign fade behind. At the window table, Ethan set his glass down again. The corner of his mouth moved just slightly. Not a smile, not contempt. A meaningless flicker from a man too accustomed to winning and losing, but rarely facing a woman bold enough to slam the door on him. He didn't know the squeal of that chair would echo in his memory for weeks, thin as a blade etched into the calm he had spent a lifetime forging. Clara sank deeper into her seat, watching streetlights stretch into golden threads. She silently vowed, never again. Fate heard and only winked. Across the city, a truck braked hard, a horn blared, and tomorrow a man would run toward red flames for the woman whose name he spoke in that flat, even tone. Fate's joke had already begun, with the words, Ethan Cole. That morning, the early winter wind swept down the narrow street leading to the high school where Clara taught. The dismissal bell rang, and groups of students poured out like flocks of chirping birds, carrying with them the sound of youthful laughter. Clara slowed her steps, clutching a stack of graded papers, her eyes following a group of students running and playing near the school gate. She smiled softly. Only these simple moments made her feel that her life truly had worth. Suddenly, a blaring car horn tore through the air. A silver sedan sped around the corner, tires screeching, but too late to stop. A 10th grade boy, lost in play, darted across the street directly into its path. Clara didn't think she only heard her heartbeat pounding in her ears. "Watch out!" She dropped the papers, dashed forward, and shoved the boy out of the way. The next instant, metal flashed before her eyes. Tires screeched against asphalt. Screams erupted behind her. A powerful force yanked Clara sideways, sending her rolling onto the curb. Air rushed from her lungs. The stench of exhaust and dust filled her nose. She opened her eyes wide only to find a familiar face, gray eyes cold and sharp, inches from her own. "Ethan! Cole!" Clara gasped, her head spinning. He still held her shoulders tightly, as if convinced that letting go would send her into danger again. His voice was hoarse but steady. "Don't misunderstand. I just did what was right." For a few seconds, the world froze. All Clara felt was her ragged breathing, her racing heartbeat, and those cold eyes, not the disdain from the restaurant days ago, but the sharp focus of a man who had just pulled her back from death's edge. Students gathered around, worried voices overlapping. "Miss Bennett, are you okay? Did that man just save you?" Clara scrambled to sit up, brushing dirt off her skirt. The boy she had pushed away still trembled, tears streaming down his face. Clara wrapped her arms around him, soothing. "It's okay now. You're safe. But next time, be careful." The boy nodded repeatedly, still shaken. Clara looked up and met Ethan's eyes. He was already on his feet, straightening his sleeve, gaze cool as though nothing had happened. With only a short nod, he turned to leave. But Clara couldn't hold back. "Wait!" Her voice rang out louder than she intended. Ethan stopped, turned. That look unsettled her again. "Why? Are you here?" He raised an eyebrow, calm as ever. "My law office is just around the corner. I stepped out to make a call and saw what happened. That was all. Nothing more." Clara bit her lip. Memories of that stormy blind date only days ago echoed in her mind. The man who had called her ordinary without value had now saved her life on instinct. The contradiction made her heart churn. "Anyway," she inhaled, searching for words. "Thank you, if it weren't for you. You pushed the boy first." Ethan cut her off, his tone still even. "If I hadn't come, you'd be the one lying in the street right now." The words slammed into Clara's chest. She wanted to argue, to deny it, but her head was still spinning. Ethan gave her one last look, the corner of his mouth twitching, uncertain if it was a smile or just a fleeting, meaningless motion. Then he turned away, his tall figure swallowed into the crowd. Clara stood frozen. The winter wind gusted by, carrying exhaust fumes and the aftertaste of fear. Her students were still chattering around her, but inside only one thought echoed. That arrogant man had just saved her life. She shivered. Was fate playing some strange joke, forcing two people who had sworn never to meet again into each other's path? Clara clenched her hands, trying to steady her heartbeat. But no matter how much she denied it, she knew. From that moment on, an invisible thread had bound her to Ethan Cole. One Monday morning, while Clara was arranging a stack of test papers on her desk, the principal called her into the office. Inside, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile introduced herself. "Clara, this is Mrs. Sanderson, a representative of the Cole Foundation. They're sponsoring a new project, Literature and Justice. We think you'd be the right candidate to teach and serve as an advisor." Clara froze for a moment. At the mere mention of the name Cole, a cold, familiar face instantly surfaced in her mind. "This project," Mrs. Sanderson continued, "will combine literary education with legal reasoning skills for teenagers. A portion of scholarships has already been prepared. This is a valuable opportunity for your students." Clara hesitated. It truly was a rare chance for her students. And when she saw the anticipation gleaming in Mrs. Sanderson's eyes, she knew she had no choice but to agree. She gave a small nod. "I'll participate." 2 weeks later, Clara stepped into the newly inaugurated Education Center. The building gleamed, classrooms designed with modern precision, so different from the cozy, familiar atmosphere of her public school. But the moment she entered the conference room, her heart sank. At the head of the table, in a gray suit, sat Ethan Cole. His gray eyes met hers without surprise, as if he had expected it all along. "Miss Bennett," he nodded, "it seems fate has a strange habit of placing us in the same place over and over." Clara bit her lip, forcing her voice to remain calm. "I'm here for my students, not for fate." A few colleagues let out awkward laughs, and the air in the room grew uncertain from the start. The Literature and Justice Project launched quickly. Clara designed her curriculum to stir emotions, using short stories and poetry to spark discussions about right and wrong, fairness and injustice. Ethan, on the other hand, brought forth plans filled with charts, numbers, and performance evaluations. We can't rely solely on emotions, Ethan argued in one meeting. Children need to train their logical reasoning. I propose adding mock trials with clear rules and graded outcomes. Clara set her pen down and looked him straight in the eye. Children aren't machines for calculating rules. If they don't learn empathy, all your logic is an empty shell. Emotions can't be measured, Ethan replied, voice low. And what can't be measured can't be managed. A project needs clear results. You're turning education into a spreadsheet, Clara snapped, louder than she intended. The room went silent. Colleagues exchanged glances. A few shook their heads slightly. In the days that followed, the conflict only deepened. In the pilot class, Clara had her students read a Sylvia Plath poem, encouraging them to express their feelings. Ethan walked in and asked them to present 3 logical arguments to defend the author in a mock court. You just turned the class into a dry debate exercise, Clara fumed afterward. And you, Ethan replied coldly, turned it into a purposeless group therapy session. Their colleagues watched with a mix of nervousness and fascination, as if witnessing a play where the 2 lead characters could do nothing but clash sparks. One afternoon in a small meeting room, Clara slammed a stack of lesson plans onto the table. Ethan, you can't impose your way on everyone. Children need to be heard, not forced. He looked up, gray eyes glinting with both fatigue and resolve. And you can't keep believing that emotions will magically turn into results. I've seen too many bright kids lose their way because they lacked a system to guide them. His words struck Clara silent for a beat. There was a shadow of something painful in his voice, but before she could ask, he turned away, cutting off the argument. That night, Clara lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling. The image of his gray, unyielding eyes haunted her, both infuriating and troubling, as though behind them was something he had never spoken aloud. But she shook her head, reminding herself it didn't matter. For her students' sake, she would keep fighting. What she didn't know was that across the city, Ethan sat alone at his desk, staring at unfinished plans. Clara's words echoed in his mind. Children need empathy, not just rules. His lips curved faintly, not quite a smirk, not quite a smile. For the first time in years, something had pierced through to a place he kept buried deep inside. Late Friday afternoon, Clara left the education center with a heavy heart after yet another contentious meeting. Ethan had rejected her ideas again, this time so sharply that the entire group of instructors had fallen silent. She walked briskly along the sidewalk, the winter wind biting against her skin, her mind boiling with one question. Why did he always have to impose his way? Lost in thought, Clara was startled by the sound of children's laughter drifting from a small nearby park. Instinct made her turn her head. Beneath an oak tree, an 8-year-old boy was practicing soccer, his thin legs awkward, but his eyes glowing with joy. And the man crouched down, tying the boy's shoelaces, was none other than Ethan Cole. Clara froze. The sight unsettled her, almost unbelievable. It was still him in his polished suit, but now with his coat off, sleeves rolled up, his face softened with a tenderness so unlike the coldness she was used to. "Uncle Ethan, I scored a goal!" the boy cheered, voice full of innocence, then threw his arms around him. The corner of Ethan's mouth curved into a smile, a real one, unforced. He ruffled the boy's hair and said gently, "Good job, Ben, but next time, keep your balance better." Clara's heart skipped. She had never imagined the man who once dismissed her work as ordinary, without value, could be so gentle with a child. She stood still for a few moments, then, hesitating, walked closer. "Sorry, I didn't mean to intrude, I just—" Ethan looked up. His gray eyes flickered with surprise, then settled back into their familiar calm. "Miss Bennett." Fate does have a strange sense of humor. The boy, Ben, stared curiously at Clara. Ethan made introductions. "This is Miss Bennett, my colleague, and this is Ben, my nephew." "Hello, miss," Ben greeted politely, his brown eyes bright and shining. Clara smiled, her heart softening. "Hello, Ben." You play soccer very well." The boy blushed while Ethan remained silent, watching. A few minutes later, they sat on a park bench. Ben ran around with his ball, leaving the two adults in a strange silence. Clara broke it first. "I didn't know you had a nephew." Ethan exhaled quietly, his eyes following Ben. "My brother and his wife died in an accident. Since then, Ben has lived with me. He's already lost too much. I just try to make up for it." Clara's chest tightened. His voice carried no chill now, only a deep, hidden sorrow. "It must be hard for him," Clara said softly, "but it looks like he adores you." Ethan pressed his lips together. "I'm not good at showing things. Ben needs gentleness, but I grew up in a house without it." Clara turned, surprised to see that his eyes were no longer sharp blades, but a still lake hiding depths she hadn't seen before. "My parents divorced when I was 10, he continued, voice lowering. "My mother left, and my father was always busy. I learned how not to need anyone. Maybe that's why I overprotect myself." In that moment, Clara understood. The arrogance, the numbers, the charts, the cutting remarks, all of it was armor for a boy who had once been left alone in the dark. "Ethan," she whispered, hesitant. He turned, his gray eyes meeting hers, deep yet fragile. "Don't mistake me. I don't need pity. I just want you to know why I believe in discipline and logic." Clara bit her lip. Her heart trembled not with pity, but with the realization that he wasn't just the arrogant man she had despised. He too knew pain. He too knew loss. His coldness was nothing but survival. Ben ran back, panting, clutching his ball. "Uncle Ethan, promise you'll play with me again tomorrow?" Ethan nodded, ruffling his hair lightly. As he bent down, the fleeting smile on his lips made Clara's chest ache in a way she couldn't explain. On her way home, Clara walked more slowly than usual. The image of Ethan tying Ben's shoelaces, the tenderness in his gaze, and the fragments of his childhood confession played over and over in her mind. She sighed. That man, the same one who once angered her enough to storm out of a restaurant, was now leaving her confused. She didn't know whether to keep her distance or listen to the stirrings of her heart. A new piece of the puzzle had been revealed, and Clara sensed there were many more parts of Ethan Cole's story she had yet to see. Tuesday morning, the school hallways buzzed louder than usual. Clara had just stepped out of her classroom when she saw a group of parents gathered outside the principal's office. Voices rose in a wave of whispers and sharp tones, led by a shrill accusation. "Miss Bennett is biased." My child deserved a higher grade, but she dragged them down because of personal dislike. Clara froze, her heart tightening. The rumor spread like wildfire. More parents pressed in, curious, while students peeked from the corners. The air was strung tight like a violin string. "Please calm down," Clara said, stepping forward with her voice soft but steady. "I have never shown favoritism to any student. I have full documentation of this child's progress." But the woman refused to listen, raising her voice even louder. "Documentation? You're the teacher. You can write whatever you want. We pay for our children to be treated fairly, not humiliated." A few parents nodded in agreement. Clara felt as if the sky itself was crashing down. She was no stranger to being misunderstood, but this public, loud and cutting, stabbed directly at the professional integrity she cherished. Just as she opened her mouth again, a deep male voice cut through the noise from behind her, clear and commanding. "Madam, Miss Bennett does not write whatever she wants. She is a teacher, and in this case, I can prove her grading is entirely fair." All eyes turned to the newcomer. Clara spun around, her heart skipped. Ethan Cole. He wasn't dressed in his usual polished suit, but in a long coat, tie loosened, looking as if he had rushed here. Yet it was the steel in his gray eyes that silenced the room. "And who are you?" the woman demanded. "Attorney Ethan Cole," he replied crisply, "and the sponsor of this education center. I was just informed of the incident." His words dropped like a hammer. The atmosphere shifted at once. Some parents stepped back uneasily. Ethan pulled a folder from his case. "I've reviewed the test papers, along with Miss Bennett's evaluation records. The grade reflects the student's actual performance. There is no evidence of bias." He paused, locking his gaze on the woman. "On the contrary, making unfounded accusations in public can be considered defamation, damaging to a teacher's reputation. If necessary, I'm prepared to take this matter to court. The hallway went deathly still. The woman's face paled. She stammered, I was only worried about my child. Worry does not give you the right to insult others, Ethan cut in, his voice cold and precise as a blade. If you truly want your child to improve, you should encourage them instead of planting the belief that success comes only through favoritism. No one dared say another word. Moments later, the woman dropped her gaze and slipped away. The crowd dispersed, leaving behind the remnants of tension. Clara still stood rooted, stunned. She looked at Ethan and suddenly saw him differently. He was no longer just the arrogant man from the blind date, no longer merely the rigid adversary in staff meetings. Now he was the man who had stood before her, willing to take the arrows of criticism in her place, and with razor-sharp reasoning had defended her honor. Her heartbeat thundered, so strong it startled her. Why are you here?" Clara asked, her voice soft, almost hoarse. Ethan straightened his tie as though nothing extraordinary had happened. "A teacher called me, worried this might affect the project. I came to ensure fairness." "Fairness?" Clara pressed her lips together, her eyes locked on his. "Or to protect me?" For the briefest moment, his gray eyes wavered. Just 1 second, but she caught it. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned away, voice calm. "Consider it both." That afternoon, Clara stood by the teacher's lounge window, watching the schoolyard empty. Inside her, a strange sensation spread, confusion mingled with warmth. She remembered his eyes when he said fairness, remembered the unshakable tone that had silenced the crowd. She whispered to herself, "Ethan Cole, who exactly are you?" The question had no answer yet, but in her heart, a small seed had been planted, and it had already begun to sprout, no matter how much she tried to deny it. Across the city in his expansive office, Ethan stood alone by the glass. Clara's bewildered face came back to him, her eyes quietly grateful, yet questioning. An unfamiliar feeling crept in, leaving him unsettled as if his cold principles had faltered for the first time. He drew in a long breath, telling himself, "Don't get involved. This is only part of the job, just the job." But in his chest, the words rang hollow. "Soul Stories fam, if you're watching on another channel, come home to us at Soul Stories, where tens of thousands of listeners and sharers come together." Saturday afternoon, Clara stopped by the mall to pick up a few reference books for her class. Carrying a paper bag in her hand, she walked out of the bookstore and froze. Directly across from her, in front of an Italian restaurant, Ethan Cole was walking beside a stunning woman. The woman held onto his arm naturally, laughing brightly, her high heels tapping against the marble floor. Together they looked every bit the perfect couple. Powerful, elegant, well-matched. Clara's heart tightened. A cold rush shot down her spine. In her mind, fragments tumbled one after another. The disastrous blind date, their heated debates, the moment he pulled her out of danger. And now this? A man who already had a girlfriend, yet still agreed to a blind date? A man who sometimes showed concern, who had defended her in front of others? So it had all been a joke? Her pride flared. Clara spun around quickly, hiding her flushed, angry face. In the days that followed, Clara avoided Ethan at all costs. At meetings, she came in late, sat far away, and gave curt answers. In the pilot class, she hardly spoke to him at all. Her coldness was so obvious that everyone noticed. At last, Ethan couldn't take it anymore. One afternoon, he blocked her path in an empty hallway. "Clara," his voice was low, restrained. "Can you explain this to me?" She clutched the stack of lesson plans in her arms, staring straight into his eyes. "Explain what? That you already have a girlfriend, but still agreed to a blind date? That you keep interfering in my life, making me think you actually cared?" Ethan's expression shifted. "Girlfriend? What are you talking about?" "I saw it," Clara snapped, her voice trembling with anger. "You with her, arm in arm. I'm not blind." Ethan went still for a moment, then his gray eyes darkened. "So just one glance is enough for you to decide everything? You'd rather trust what you saw than trust me?" Clara let out a bitter laugh, though her chest ached. "Trust you? Ethan, from the very first day we met, you called me ordinary, without value. After all that, do you really think I have any reason left to trust you? He stepped closer, his breath hot, voice sharp. Prejudice. You're always so quick to slap labels on me. You never once truly tried to understand me, Clara. Maybe because you never let me, she shot back, her eyes blazing with both fury and tears. The air between them stretched so tight it was ready to snap. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. Finally he turned, his voice hoarse but resolute. If you've decided to believe what you saw and not who I am, then there's nothing left for us to say. The hallway door slammed shut behind him. Clara stood frozen, her chest in knots. Anger still burned, but beneath it lay a wound that ached deeply. She bit her lip until it bled, whispering in despair, Ethan Cole, why do you make me want to forget you, yet never stop thinking about you? That night in his vast apartment, Ethan sat by the window overlooking the city lights. The glass of wine in his hand did nothing to cool the fire inside him. Clara's wounded eyes, her accusations, replayed over and over, weighing heavily on his heart. He growled under his breath, She doesn't believe me, not even once. And inside him, an emptiness he had never known before began to spread. The day of the Literature and Justice event, the weather turned suddenly cold. The education center glowed brightly from early morning, posters lining the hallways, essay exhibits, illustrated poems, and the mock mini courtroom, buzzing with parents and students alike. Clara stood at the exhibition booth, adjusting her nameplate, forcing a polite smile, though the wound from her last quarrel with Ethan still lingered inside. Miss Bennett, our class poem got praised, a girl exclaimed. Clara nodded, offering warm words of encouragement. From the third floor, the sound system crackled as microphones were tested. A draft swept through the main doors, carrying the scent of fresh paper and polished wood. Everything seemed to flow smoothly. Then the fire alarm shrieked. The piercing siren ripped through the air, shattering the festive mood. Red lights flashed relentlessly. The crowd erupted in panic like startled birds. Thin smoke began to snake across the ceiling from the catering kitchen. Stay calm. Everyone move to the emergency exits, the guard shouted. Clara instantly grabbed two students by the hand, guiding them down the hallway. The floor vibrated beneath her feet as she counted firmly, reassuring them. Line up, no pushing, follow me. Parents, children, colleagues, everyone poured into the stairwell in groups. The smoke thickened, stinging the eyes, acrid with the burning scent of plastic. Clara pressed a cloth to her mouth, leading her group down to the first floor until a frantic cry pierced the chaos. Someone's missing! Where's Ben? Where's Ben? Clara's heart jolted. Ben. His name struck her chest like a spark on dry wood. She pictured his bright little face swallowed by gray smoke. She turned back toward the hallway, where the haze was thickening into a wall. No, Clara! A teacher tried to stop her. You need to get outside first. There's still a student inside, she shot back, scanning the hall. I have to go. Wait for the fire crew. But Clara was already running. She pushed against the flow of people, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The fire door hung ajar. She shoved it open with her elbow, and a black wave of smoke crashed into her like a beast. Heat lashed her skin. The flashing alarm splattered the marble floor with streaks of red light. Ben! Clara crouched low, coughing as she shouted. Ben, answer me! No reply. Only the crackle of wood, the long wail of sirens. She remembered, near the hall, Ben loved running circles around the water station. She felt her way forward, hands scraping along the wall for balance. The glass doors of the auditorium stood slightly open, smoke curling out like a black serpent's tongue. Clara plunged inside. Darkness mottled with red. The exit sign flickered weakly at the far end. On stage, the backdrop smoldered at the edges, flames licking upward like hungry tongues. Sweat mingled with soot down her neck, her eyes burning so badly that each blink stabbed. Ben! Her voice rasped, breaking. Crash! A display board toppled only feet away. Clara stumbled back, her shoe slipping on broken plastic. Pain stabbed her palm as she caught herself on the floor. Then a voice deep and raw, cutting through alarms. Clara! Her chest clenched at the sound. She turned. Out of the smoke emerged Ethan Cole, tall and urgent, Coat discarded, sleeves rolled high, a damp cloth tied over his mouth. He barreled forward, hauling her up in one swift motion. "Are you insane?" His voice was ragged, gray eyes flashing. "Why would you come in here alone?" "Ben," Clara gasped. "He's trapped." "No." Ethan's tone cracked but held firm, his grip anchoring her shoulders. "Ben's outside. He went to the restroom before the alarm. My staff already got him to the assembly point." Clara froze. The words punched the breath from her lungs. "Ben is safe." Relief surged so fast her knees buckled. She clutched his arm, shame and gratitude colliding when the ceiling groaned overhead. A chunk collapsed, showering dust. "Move!" Ethan yanked her down, shielding her as debris rained, gritty and sharp. For a second she saw his neck cord tense, his breath jagged, his eyes blazing not with coldness, but something raw, almost desperate. "Stay with me." He bent low, keeping her pressed ahead. "Crawl by the wall." "I'll lead." Clara nodded, throat raw. She crawled, tears stinging her eyes from the smoke. The burnt plastic taste coated her tongue. Ethan inched forward, one hand sweeping along the wall, the other never leaving her shoulder. Each time she faltered, coughing hard, he paused, angling his body to shield her from the worst of the heat. "Almost there," he urged steadily. "Count with me 3, 2, 1. They burst through the exit, collapsing into the outer hallway. Cold air blasted their faces. Clara choked on coughs, eyes squeezed shut. Ethan dragged her upright, half carrying her toward the stairwell. Each step down felt as though it were doubled beneath her shaking legs. The ground floor opened into chaos. Firefighters rushing, water spraying in white arcs. Someone draped a blanket around Clara's shoulders and pressed a water bottle into her hands. She coughed. Blinking, Ethan was right beside her, his shirt damp with sweat and smoke, hair disheveled, soot smeared on his cheek. For the first time, he looked undone. "Are you okay?" His voice was taut as he bent closer. Clara nodded, eyes brimming with smoke, fear, and something else unnamed. "Ben, really, safe?" "Safe," Ethan assured, his mouth twitching at the corner, almost a smile. "He's in the parking lot with staff." Clara exhaled hard, her shoulders sagging as if a hidden debt had been paid. She gripped the bottle, hands still trembling. Moments later, Ben came running, throwing his arms around her. "Miss Bennett! I was in the restroom. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the alarm." Clara hugged him tight, laughing through a broken voice. "It's okay. Next time, make sure to tell an adult, all right?" Ben nodded furiously, then turned to hug Ethan too. "Uncle Ethan!" Ethan ruffled his hair, his expression softening for a fleeting moment that made Clara's chest ache. When Ben ran back to the students, silence settled between them. "You took too big a risk," Clara whispered, staring at her hands to avoid his gaze. "So did you." Ethan tilted his shoulder as a medic pressed a cold pack against a scrape on his arm. "Why go in when you weren't sure anyone was trapped?" Clara gave a weary, self-conscious laugh. "Because if he had been inside and I'd done nothing, I could never have forgiven myself." Ethan said nothing. The wind cut under the awning, tugging at the blanket on her shoulders. Gently, he pulled it tighter around her, the motion careful, almost reverent, as though afraid of hurting her. "Don't do that again," he said, voice low, stripped of its usual edge. "At least, not alone." Clara lifted her eyes. In the gray depths that once struck her as icy, she now saw warmth and a fear so raw it made her heart lurch. The image of him barreling through smoke, his hand clamped on her shoulder, his body shielding hers, all of it struck like lightning to the tenderest part of her soul. She wanted to thank him, to apologize, to say she had misjudged him, but her throat still felt full of smoke. The words stayed unspoken, shimmering instead in her gaze as she held his a second too long. "Clara," Ethan murmured, tilting his head to catch her eyes. "Are you truly okay?" "I'm okay," she nodded, then added softly, "because of you." A flicker touched his eyes, thin, quick, almost shy. They stood side by side under the awning, watching the fire hoses smother the last of the flames. Around them, relieved chatter rose. The sirens fell silent, and only the patter of water dripped onto concrete. Inside Clara, something was shifting. No longer the sharp edge of pride, nor the sting of anger. Softer, warmer, like a seed breaking soil after a storm. He always protects me, the thought rang clear. Yet another voice whispered hesitation. The distance of misunderstandings, the sting of harsh words, the fear of stepping forward and falling. Ethan turned toward the parking lot where Ben waved. "I'll take you both home," he said, his voice composed again. "The doctor wants you monitored. You shouldn't be alone tonight." Clara nodded faintly. She walked beside him, the blanket snug around her shoulders, catching the faint scent of smoke mixed with citrus from his wrist. With every step, she felt something shifting inside her chest, slow, steady, irreversible. Beyond the fence, the sunset spilled a thin band of orange. Today the fire was out, but in their hearts another flame had just begun to burn. That evening after the fire, Clara sat alone in her small apartment. The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock, yet in her head still echoed the shrill fire alarm, the thunderous crash of the ceiling, and Ethan's hoarse cry. "Clara!" She could still feel the heat when he wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, still see the worry burning in his gray eyes. Her heart trembled every time she replayed it. But along with that came shame. She had been harsh. She had judged him wrong. A knock at the door startled her. When she opened it, Ethan stood there. He still wore the white shirt from earlier, rumpled now, the cuffs smudged with soot that hadn't been washed out. He looked as if he had walked straight from the fire to her door, his eyes tired but unyielding. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low, restrained. Clara hesitated, then nodded and stepped aside. The small living room magnified his presence. Ethan stood stiff, backed for a long moment before exhaling, as if gathering all his courage to speak. "The woman you saw the other day," he paused, eyes dropping to the floor. "She's not my girlfriend. She's my cousin. I was escorting her to meet a client, and when we stepped outside, that's when you walked by." Clara froze. Part of her wanted to feel relieved, but her pride surged instead. "And I thought," her voice trailed off, her cheeks burning, "God, I accused you wrongly." Ethan lifted his gaze, the icy sharpness gone, replaced by something gentler. "Clara, I wasn't angry because you misunderstood. I was angry because you've never trusted me, not once." His words pierced straight through the softest part of her heart. Clara bit her lip, her eyes glistening. "You've never given me a reason to trust you. From the very first day, you called me ordinary. You've always been cold, always judgmental." He stepped closer, the distance collapsing until she had to look up at him. His voice, low and rough, carried not sharpness, but the weight of a painful admission. "I'm not as arrogant as you think. I've just never learned how to love, so I hide behind rigidity to protect myself." Clara's breath hitched, her heart pounding wildly. In his eyes, she no longer saw judgment, but a fragile fear, the fear of rejection, of being left behind. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. He shook his head, his voice breaking. "Tonight, when I saw you run into the fire without thinking, I realized I couldn't stand by. I was terrified of losing you. That feeling was so new, so strong. It nearly crushed me." Clara stood frozen. Each word dropped like stones into the still lake of her soul, rippling outward, unstoppable. She wanted to believe him, wanted to let go, to run into his arms. But somewhere deep inside, a fear lingered. The fear that if she gave everything, one day he would walk away, leaving her alone. "You say that," Clara shook her head, laughing softly through tears. "I don't know whether to be happy or afraid." Ethan raised a hand but stopped midway, as if afraid a sudden move would push her further away. His voice was barely a whisper. "Don't be afraid. I'm learning how to love through you." In that moment, the tiny apartment filled with a heavy silence. Outside, the wind rattled the window frame. Clara's heart melted, yet her feet felt pinned to the floor. "Give me time, Ethan," she murmured. "I need to be sure I'm not walking into a dead end." He nodded, closing his eyes as if to contain the ache. "I'll wait." When Ethan left, Clara stood by the window, clutching her chest. Inside her, emotions swirled, hesitation tangled with warmth, leaving her both trembling and comforted. The wall of pride around Ethan had cracked, revealing a real heart. But to break through her own fear, she knew she would need one more proof. And deep down, Clara sensed that the trials ahead would force them both to choose. A week after the fire, the atmosphere at the education center felt entirely different. Meetings were no longer sharp with tension. Instead, a quiet undercurrent settled over the room. Clara and Ethan now sat at the same table, exchanging only brief words about work, but no longer with daggers hidden in their voices. Clara found it strange. After that evening in her apartment, after Ethan's half-confession, she kept her distance, but at the same time, she couldn't stop herself from listening whenever he spoke. He was no longer just the arrogant lawyer. A different side of him had surfaced, vulnerable and capable of care. That day's discussion centered on the plan for a special class. The students would write a short essay on justice and then stage a mock debate modeled after a trial. They need a clear framework to practice reasoning, Ethan said, laying a logic chart on the board. They can't just write based on feelings. They must have a claim, supporting evidence and proof. Standing beside him, Clara smiled faintly. But they also need to speak from the heart. If it's only rules, their writing will be lifeless. I think we should allow each student to include a short personal reflection. That way they see justice isn't just law, it's also human. Ethan glanced at her. His gray eyes, usually so cold, softened for a beat. Half logic, half emotion? Clara nodded. That's what fairness is. Slowly, he nodded back. No argument followed. For the first time, Clara felt he was truly listening. In the days that followed, the two became an unexpected duo in front of the students. Clara told a literary story, her voice so compelling that the room fell silent. Then Ethan analyzed it from a legal perspective. If this character were in court, what verdict would you expect? The class buzzed with debate. The students were both moved and challenged to think critically. Clara watched the spark in their eyes, something she rarely saw before. One girl stood up, her eyes shining. Miss, I never thought a story could connect to law like this. It's both moving and structured. Clara smiled, and without realizing, her eyes slid toward Ethan. He was already looking at her, his gaze carrying a quiet, unspoken agreement. In the teacher's lounge, colleagues began whispering to one another. Those two are working together really well lately. They used to clash like fire and water. Now they look like the perfect pair. Clara overheard, her cheeks heating as she quickly buried herself in her files, but her heartbeat gave her away, racing far faster than usual. One afternoon, they were rearranging desks for the mock trial class. Clara bent down to lift a heavy chair, but it wouldn't budge. A steady hand pressed over hers, lifting with ease. Let me, Ethan said quietly. They both bent lower, and suddenly the distance shrank until Clara could hear his breath. His fingers brushed across the back of her hand, a fleeting touch, yet enough to send a jolt of electricity through her spine. Startled, she pulled back, but her heart refused to calm. Ethan's lips curved into the faintest smile before he turned away without a word. That evening, Clara returned home in a daze. In the mirror, her face glowed faintly pink. She pressed her hand over her chest and whispered, Clara Bennett, get a grip. This is Ethan Cole, for heaven's sake. But the image of his softened gray eyes, of his steady hand over hers, replayed endlessly, filling her sleep with sweet, blurry dreams. Meanwhile, in his office, Ethan flipped through pages of plans without absorbing a word. Clara's warm smile as she engaged with the students wouldn't leave his mind. He shook his head, chuckling bitterly at himself. You're changing, Ethan Cole. The opposite pieces were slowly clicking together. Logic and emotion, law and literature, coldness and warmth. Neither spoke it aloud, but every glance, every accidental touch, every skipped heartbeat said it for them. And everyone around could see it. The relationship was shifting, from rivals into something fragile, but full of promise. On Saturday morning, Clara had just stepped out of her favorite bookstore when a familiar voice sounded behind her. Clara? She froze. That voice. After all these years, it was still etched into her memory. She turned, and standing before her was a tall man with neatly combed brown hair, bright eyes, and a smile tinged with hesitation. Daniel, her first love. The one who had held her hand through their student years, who had once promised her a future, before leaving her behind to pursue his career in another city. Clara's grip tightened around the handle of her bag. "Daniel, what are you doing here?" He gave a strained smile, regret flickering in his eyes. "I just moved back. I I haven't stopped thinking about you. I know I was wrong to leave, but if there's any chance, I want to make it right. I want us to start over." Clara faltered. Her heart rippled with memories. Daniel shielding her with his umbrella on rainy days, their long nights studying side by side, that very first embrace. Yet just as quickly, another image surfaced: Ethan's gray eyes in the fire, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, the quiet fear in his gaze when he almost lost her. Daniel reached for her hand, his voice fervent. "I gave everything to my career, but now I realize the most important thing I lost was you." Clara pulled her hand back, her heart in turmoil. She forced a small smile. "Daniel, that was a long time ago." But his eyes hardened with resolve. "I'll wait. I believe we still have a chance." In the days that followed, Daniel returned to the education center repeatedly. He brought Clara coffee in the mornings and sometimes showed up with an umbrella when it rained. Ethan, from a distance, caught sight of her walking beside Daniel. He stood still, watching. Daniel leaned in to say something. Clara gave a small, hesitant smile, awkward, yet in Ethan's eyes it cut like a knife. Hannah, carrying a stack of papers, passed by and whispered, "That's Daniel, Clara's first love." They used to be inseparable. Ethan's chest tightened. He didn't ask for, nor did he demand, an explanation. He simply turned away, his footsteps heavier than ever. That night, Ethan found himself at a small bar with Ryan, his longtime friend. In the dim glow, with lazy jazz floating through the air, Ethan sat brooding, a glass of whiskey in his hand. Ryan eyed him, frowning. "You've been silent all night. What's going on?" Ethan gave a dry laugh, the amber liquid catching the light. "What if she chooses someone else, Ryan? What if her past is strong enough to pull her back?" Ryan leaned back, tapping his fingers on the table. "So what, are you just going to sit here, drink, and let her go?" "You're a lawyer, Ethan. You know silence is still a verdict, and it always favors the side that refuses to speak up." Ethan's brow furrowed. "Listen," Ryan continued firmly, "if you stay quiet, you're the one handing her over. Love isn't just about actions. It has to be spoken." Ethan set down his glass, his gray eyes darkening. Silence stretched, heavy and long. Finally he nodded, his voice low but resolute. "You're right. It's time I face this." Meanwhile, Clara sat alone in her apartment, her heart a tangle of emotions. Daniel knocked on the door of her past, while Ethan stirred something fragile yet fierce in her present. She feared that no matter which path she chose, someone would get hurt, and she herself wouldn't escape unscathed. She whispered to herself, "Do I have enough courage to trust again?" And she didn't yet know Ethan was preparing to shatter the silence and finally lay everything bare. 3 days passed, and the education center felt strangely quiet to Clara. She still went to class, still laughed with her students, still finished grading her papers. But during every break, her hand would drift toward her phone, then stop short. Ethan hadn't shown up at the brief meetings, hadn't sent her anything beyond a curt "seen." The absence stretched thin, like a fragile thread ready to snap with the slightest touch. On Wednesday afternoon, just as Clara finished stacking her papers, a figure filled the doorway. Ethan, his dark coat, loosened tie, and hollowed features looked harsher than usual, but his gray eyes, fixed on her, were stripped of the icy armor. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and rough. "Right now, if you'll let me." Clara held her breath for a beat, then nodded. "All right." The car pulled away from the center, weaving through streets just lighting up for the evening. Clara didn't ask where they were going. Ethan didn't explain. They sat in silence, the only sound the windshield wipers sweeping away a thin layer of dust. The city thinned out, giving way to rows of old houses, cracked sidewalks bearing the scars of time. The car stopped in front of a small house in the suburbs. Dark brick walls, a narrow porch, wooden window frames faded with age. A wind chime swayed unevenly, tinkling weakly in the breeze. "My old house," Ethan said, keeping his hand on the wheel as if he needed another moment to steady himself. I grew up here. Clara turned toward him. Something in his voice made her throat dry. Are you sure I should come in? I brought you here so nothing between us stays locked behind a door. Ethan unlocked the entrance and pushed. The wooden door creaked loudly. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and dust, with the faint trace of old citrus-like memories left untouched. The living room was small, a crooked armchair, a lamp patched with tape, faded photo frames. The walls were blotched with uneven paint, as if they had covered over too many things best forgotten. Ethan stood in the center of the room for a long silence. Then he pointed toward a corner. When I was 10, I sat right there the day my mother left. My father called a cab, and she carried 2 suitcases. They spoke softly, but I heard one line clearly. I'm tired. The door closed like someone had switched off the light. I thought if I studied harder, behaved better, maybe she'd come back. She didn't. Clara didn't speak. She simply stepped lighter, as though the silence itself was holding him upright. Dad worked all the time, Ethan continued, his voice flat, but each word scraping raw. When he was home, it was numbers, schedules, discipline. I learned emotions only ruin things, so I locked them away. When my brother died, I realized I'd forgotten how to ask, "Are you okay?" We never said it. Too late. His hand tightened against the back of the chair, knuckles pale. So I put on the armor of logic and numbers. It kept me from getting lost. It also made people see me as arrogant, cold, and most of the time, I let them. Easier than explaining. Clara moved closer, stopping right in front of him. And now, Ethan lifted his head. His gray eyes met her brown ones. And for a moment, Clara saw the 10-year-old boy curled in that corner, hugging his knees, swallowing his sobs so no one would be bothered. Now, Ethan said slowly, I hate that I used that armor on you. I was afraid to admit what I felt, afraid you'd choose someone else, choose your past. But these last few days, I realized something. If I don't tell you, I'll lose you forever. And that thought is worse than any fear I've ever learned to endure. He stepped back, giving his words space to stand. Clara, He stopped, swallowed hard as though pronouncing a word for the first time. I love you. Not because you make the project more efficient, or because you fit neatly into my plans. I love the way you bend down to hear a student speak, the way you look at a poem like it's a doorway. I love that you ran into smoke without hesitation, even though it drove me insane. I even love the way you argue with me, because at least then, you're always honest. Clara's eyes blurred, not from pretty words, but from how hard they came out, as if each one was a piece of armor clattering to the floor. She whispered, her voice trembling. I was angry at you. I misunderstood. I thought you had someone else. I was proud and I was afraid of being hurt again. I said things that cut you. I'm sorry. I'm sorry too, Ethan answered, not looking away. Forever calling you ordinary. There's nothing ordinary about the way you make a child believe their voice deserves to be heard. A cold draft slipped through the doorframe, rattling the wind chime. Clara thought suddenly of Daniel Rainey days, promises, then leaving for ambition. That memory no longer stung like a knife. It was just an old photo tucked in a drawer. Standing before her now was the man who had run into the fire, who had bent his pride to confess. Daniel is the past, Clara said firmly this time. I'm grateful for what we had, but I don't want to live inside old pictures. My present and I hope my future is you, Ethan. He froze. The tension in his jaw loosened slowly, like a cord untying. Are you sure? Clara nodded. I'm sure. But you need to remember this. I don't need perfection. I need someone willing to admit they're scared, to listen, and to stay when things get hard. Ethan exhaled, almost laughing. I'll learn. Maybe slowly, maybe clumsily, but I will learn. The space between them closed. Ethan raised his hand, still with that old instinct to hold back, but this time Clara placed her hand over his. His skin was warm, his palm large and slightly trembling. In that touch, something inside her clicked into place. Can I hold you? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes. He pulled her into his arms. It wasn't a tight grip, gentle, careful, as if he were holding something precious he had just found again. His coat smelled of wood, dust, and a faint citrus, the scent of old memory blending into something uniquely his. Clara rested her forehead against his shoulder, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Misunderstandings dissolved like salt in warm water. Fear still lingered, the fear any heart knows after being left, but alongside it, something new was growing. Trust. Tomorrow, Ethan murmured, still holding her. I'll tell you everything about the project plans, and you'll tell me everything you think. We can argue if we must, but we'll never stay silent again. Clara gave a soft laugh. Fair deal, counselor. Not a deal, he corrected, tilting his head to see her more clearly. A promise. She nodded. A promise. Outside, the mist thickened. Inside that little house, they stood in each other's arms for a long time, as though making up for all the years lost. The wind chime rang once more, this time not trembling, but clear. When they finally pulled apart, still holding hands, Ethan led Clara around the house. He pointed to the wall, where faded pencil marks showed his and his brother's heights, and to the wooden desk, where his father once typed endlessly. It was so loud, but I trained myself to fall asleep to the noise. He didn't say much, but it was enough. Clara could see this man wasn't just a cold CEO. He was a boy who had learned silence to survive, now relearning words to love. At the door, Ethan paused. Thank you for coming here. Thank you for opening the door, Clara replied. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't saying, I love you, but letting someone walk into the room you've always kept locked. Ethan smiled, a rare, warm smile that lit up the old hallway. Then stay in that room. I'll repaint the walls if you'd like. Fine, Clara teased, eyes glimmering, but bright colors, and leave space for a new picture frame. What kind of frame? A frame for the present. Ethan nodded. The present, he repeated, as though carving the word into the wood itself. They stepped outside. Mist lay thin on the pavement, streetlights spilling gold over the worn bricks. Ethan opened the car door for Clara, his hand brushing lightly against her back, a small gesture, but deliberate. As the car rolled away, Clara looked back once more at the house, a dark speck in the night, but glowing in her memory. Inside the car, their hands found each other and intertwined. Neither spoke. The confession had been made. The choice had been answered. The silence between them was no longer a wall, but a blanket, wrapped over two hearts finally at rest after a storm. That night, the city slept late, and their love, after so much hesitation, finally began at the right time, in the truest way, with a promise never to stay silent again. 1 year later, the education center Clara and Ethan had built together had become the pride of the city. What began as a small pilot project, Literature and Justice, had spread to multiple schools, attracting hundreds of students. Children who had once been shy and withdrawn now stood confidently before crowds, arguing their cases with both reason and heart. Clara Bennett's name began appearing in education magazines. She was called the face of humanistic education, a young teacher who dared to weave literature and justice together, inspiring her students with both the love of words and the belief in fairness. Whenever asked about her success, Clara always smiled and said, I only plant the seeds. I'm not the only one who nurtures them into trees. And though she didn't say it out loud, her eyes always sought Ethan. That evening at the Community Education Contribution Awards, the hall glowed with lights. Hundreds of attendees filled the seats, including teachers, students, parents, and sponsors. Clara's name was called, and she walked to the stage in a round of thunderous applause, her eyes shimmering, though she remained humble. Thank you to all my students, Clara said in her short speech. You've taught me more than I ever imagined. And thank you to those who believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. As she bowed, applause rang out again. But then, the lights dimmed until only a single spotlight shone on the front row. Ethan stood, dressed in a sleek black suit. He held a microphone. His deep voice rolled through the hall. Forgive me for interrupting, but there's something I've never said in public, and tonight, in front of our students, colleagues, and friends, I want to say it. The hall fell silent. Clara turned, her heart pounding. Ethan walked to the stage facing her. His gray eyes gleamed with the resolve only possible from someone who had finally laid down his armor. He knelt, drew a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it. The diamond ring sparkled beneath the lights, but brighter still was his voice. Clara Bennett, a year ago on our blind date, you called me arrogant. You weren't wrong, but you've taught me what it means to listen, to feel, and to love. I won't promise perfection, but I promise you'll never face the world alone. Will you marry me? Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by a hush so deep it ached. Clara raised her hand to her mouth, tears pooling in her eyes. Images flooded back. Ethan wrapping a blanket around her shoulders in the fire, his late-night confession in his childhood home, their furious debates and fragile truces. She nodded, her voice breaking. Yes. The hall erupted. Students leapt to their feet, clapping wildly. Colleagues whistled, and Hannah screamed at the top of her lungs, I told you so! I thought I'd failed, but turns out I pulled off the matchmaking of the century. Clara laughed through her tears, glancing at Hannah, then back at Ethan. So, my love story began with an arrogant man after all. Ethan squeezed her hand and smiled. And it will never end. Months later, their wedding took place in a garden drenched with light. White flowers lined the aisle, and a small orchestra played a gentle symphony. Clara wore a gown of soft lace, lavender sprigs tucked into her hair. Ethan stood waiting at the end of the aisle, his eyes never leaving hers for even a second. When Clara placed her hand in his, the whole world seemed to fall silent. Vows were exchanged, sealed with a sweet kiss, in the presence of family, friends, and students alike. Hannah dabbed her eyes, laughing through her tears. From blind date to forever date, now that's a story. Clara leaned her head against Ethan's shoulder as they swayed to the waltz, her eyes glowing with happiness. She whispered, I'm not afraid anymore. Because you're by my side. Ethan tightened his hold on her waist, whispering back, and I'll be here. Always. Beneath the glowing lights, amid cheers and laughter, they danced. All misunderstandings and old wounds had melted away. Only smiles, love, and a brand new beginning remained. Thank you for being part of Soul Stories. If you're listening on another channel, come back to the official home so you can continue our love journeys together with the Soul Stories family.